Welcome everyone to the Balsillie School Environment and Resources Cluster discussion on cities and climate with David Miller and Sarah Burch. I'm Neil Craik. I'm in the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, as well as the Balsillie School. I am the co-lead along with Deborah Van Nyneten of the research cluster. We have a really interesting and fun discussion with David and Sarah today. But before I start, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. For those of you who aren't members of the cluster, the Environment and Resources Research Cluster is one of 6 research clusters that operates out of the Balsillie School. Our focus is on international governance and policy dimensions of environmental and resource issues, and our mandate is to facilitate research and other scholarly activities, and to be a platform to help our members communicate the research findings and facilitate collaborations, and also to support our many PhD and master's students in their endeavors. The cluster is open to BSA faculty and students in UW and Laurier, but I think Deb and I have a fairly liberal interpretation of who can be a member of the cluster. So if you're interested in participating in future cluster activities, please let Deborah or I know, and we'd be happy to include you. In terms of future activities, we'll have another one of these discussions the week of June the 1st on sustainable and climate finance in China and Canada with Olaf Weber from UW and Christoph Netapil Wang, the director of the Green Belt and Road Initiative Center at the Institute of Green Finance at Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing. So someone who's got a lot of insight into what's going on in China. And on June 18th, we're having a PhD proposal workshop featuring about 5 or 6 of our BSAA PhD students looking for input into their proposals covering areas of climate, food, and green infrastructure. So for faculty members with interests in those areas and would be happy to share their insights with some of our PhD students, please let Deborah or I know. Turning to today's discussion, I think most or all of you are familiar with our speakers, so I'm not going to give you long bios, but I will confirm their joint and several awesomeness. David is the Director of International Diplomacy for the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. He's a former mayor of the city of Toronto, was integral in leading their climate policies, and was really ahead of many cities at the time. He's the author of a forthcoming book, Solved: How the World's Great Cities Are Fixing Climate Change, which I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about from David. Sarah is a faculty member here at the Balsillie School and in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management in the Faculty of Environment at UW. She's a Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Governance and Innovation and the Director of the Sustainable Policy Research on Urban Transformation, or SPROUT Lab. And so how we're going to manage this is Deb and I are going to disappear, and David and Sarah are going to have a bit of a conversation and make some remarks. There is an opportunity for Q&A, and perhaps maybe Deb, if you can just explain to people how that's going to work.
Sure. So because we have so many people on the webinar today, which is great, we do need to leave you muted and you won't have video. But what we would encourage you to do, because we hope to have lots of time for questions, if you would please put your question in the Q&A. So just, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, put your question in, and I will relay your question. But as I'm relaying the question, our administrator here at the Balsillie School will unmute you so you can have a little bit of a back and forth with either Sarah or David. So let me know who the question's for, and I will read the question itself, and then you'll be unmuted, and then we can have some back and forth, and hopefully we can get through lots of questions in the time allotted.
Terrific. Thanks, Deb. Okay, so on with the show. Over to you, David and Sarah.
Great, thanks. It's on to you, David. You get to start. Okay, it's my obligation. Thanks very much, Neil and Deborah, for that great introduction. Sarah, I want to know everything that you're doing at the moment. I'm quite intrigued because the last time we spoke, which is a little while ago, you were doing some really interesting research. But first, I do need to do two things. First, promote my book. So this is my book, Solved. I have buttons. Indeed, I'm even wearing one. Published by the University of Toronto Press, and it will be out in September, October, hopefully. I actually spent until this call changing a paragraph, much against the advice of my publisher, because it's literally going to print tomorrow or Monday, I think. Second thing I wanted to say is a very big thank you to the University of Waterloo, particularly Dean Jean, who has been very, very helpful in my book, including finding a student who was interested to research, who's Heather McDermott, who has a master's, and who did a ton of work on the book and wrote early drafts of several of the chapters, substantial parts of them. And it's thanks to Heather and the University of Waterloo that I was able to write the book. So it's about cities and climate change, and the thesis of it is if we take the best ideas that are happening somewhere in one city today, we can get the world back on track to having emissions by 2030, which is what science tells us is necessary. If we take the best ideas and do them at scale and pace globally, we can get the world back on track. That's my 37-second synopsis, Professor. So why don't you talk about your work a bit, and then we can chat, and over to you.
Sure, yeah, that's great. I'm very excited to read it, I have to say.
Me too.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I hope we'll come back to you for all of the, this really actionable solutions and the really exciting progress that cities are making, because I couldn't agree more that there's so much that's happening, but, accelerating it, deepening it, sharing it between and among cities is really, the challenge that faces us now. Yeah, so I guess, there's a couple of points that I just want to sort of float out there, and we can kind of discuss them as we go. I don't think anybody, certainly not you, and probably none of the participants here with us today, have to be convinced of how important it is to tackle climate change in the context of urban spaces, just given the proportion of emissions that are produced there and how vulnerable they are to impacts and such. But we're finding ourselves right now in a really unusual time. So I think I hope we can discuss a little bit how the COVID lockdown and the recovery that's to come can or might not support that accelerated progress towards reducing emissions. So that's just something to kind of put on the table for you and I to discuss, because there's a lot to say there. But I guess a couple of bits of our work at the Sprout Lab and our team that we're working on right now. So, the biggest initiative that we're working on is an international project called Transform. And I and a great team at the University of Waterloo have partnered with researchers in Arizona and in Melbourne, Australia, and Germany and Sweden and Netherlands and other places to try and work on the issue of the contribution that small businesses can play towards transforming urban spaces along a sort of more sustainable pathway. So that's where we're focusing a lot of our efforts right now. And, we're really interested in businesses that take deeply transformative approaches to sustainability, not just kind of the incremental, small, fringy stuff, but the really overhauling their business model, their reason for being, why they do what they do to make progress on sustainability. And I think that that's really, unfortunately, but fortunately, I guess, timely, because small businesses are getting walloped right now as part of the COVID lockdown. And what we are really curious about is, what are those strategies that small firms might be using right now to be more resilient in light of this massive disruption? So that's kind of occupying all of our time right now. And also alongside all of this, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this UN global scientific collaboration on climate change is in the midst of its 6th assessment report. And I'm a lead author on that. So we're working on the chapter on accelerating the transition to sustainable development. So that's kind of, aside from, homeschooling and just sort of working through each day as it comes, that's what's occupying me at the moment.
Sounds like 3 full-time jobs.
At least, yes.
I think we should probably talk about COVID first,
Yeah.
because it's subsumed everything, and the response to it is so massive. I guess a few things on that. First of all, in my work at the C40 as Director of International Diplomacy, I have a variety of responsibilities, but for example, I lead our team that liaises with the Conference of the Parties and the UN and the UN processes, and there's connections with cities on writing the reports, and to the extent that it comes through a C40 city, it comes through my team. As part of that work, my team is responsible for supporting a global mayor's task force on COVID recovery. And it's been really fascinating work because it's so timely and critical. For those who don't know, the C40 is an organization established by Mayor Ken Livingstone of London in 2005. It's an organization of the mayors of the world's major cities, at the moment 94 of them. There's no membership dues. The only requirement is that you have a plan to peak carbon emissions by this year, and be part of a collective halving of them by 2030 to net zero by 2050. A little bit later for cities in the developing world in terms of peaking, but that's the membership requirement. If you've got a plan that's going to do that and you're taking the actions, you can be a member. And it's a mayor's organization. And that at this moment is really important because although many of the responses to COVID are national and subnational, provincial, or state, it's really on the ground where we see the impacts, whether it's in small business or in city government. So the mayors, led by the mayor of Milan, have asked us to support their collaborative work about the recovery. So it's called the Global Mayors Task Force on Recovery. And I've asked the facilitator to post in the chat, because I don't think I can, the principles they agreed to a couple of weeks ago. They're really powerful because what the mayors see is a very deep connection between equity, low carbon, health, and recovery from COVID. And by the way, they've been working together on response to COVID. We've had some amazing stuff. Nanjing, for example, in China, has donated personal protective equipment to a range of cities. They offered to donate to Toronto. I don't know if that happened or not. Because cities are at a different stage in dealing with the pandemic in different places in the world, we've had mayoral-only webinars in which they talk to each other and listen to each other. So Seoul, for example, early on presented their experience. And we have countries or cities and mayors in Africa saying things like, this is fantastic, very helpful, but when you tell us that we have to tell people to wash their hands, remember that half of the people in our city don't have access to running water. Mm-hmm. It's been really, really interesting. So the principles that they've agreed on, and their interim report will be out in about 4 weeks or so, maybe a little bit longer, depending on when the appropriate public release moment will be, but it'll be ready in 4 weeks. The principles they've agreed to are that the recovery from COVID needs to be low carbon, that the recovery has to be equitable. And it's been so clear from what's happened in COVID that in the same way climate change impacts the least well-off, COVID is impacting the least well-off. Some of it for the same reasons. We've seen clusters of serious cases in Italy, for example, where air quality is really bad. People have pre-existing disposition to airborne illnesses. They have a health condition because of the air quality. Why is the air quality bad? Well, for similar reasons. It's coming from the same kind of causes that cause climate change. And so the mayors are really driving an agenda that is about how do we rebuild's the wrong word, but how do we reconnect our cities in ways that are fair, low carbon, and healthy. So for example, we see this idea of the 15-minute city or 15-minute neighborhood in places like Paris and Milan, and Vancouver has a similar concept where mayors have directed that road space be repurposed for walking and cycling so that people in a healthy and active way and a safe way, because they can be spread out, can get around their neighborhoods to do their daily needs like shopping, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And some of these changes are becoming permanent. Really fascinating. It's also worrying because a big worry globally is about public transport. And in a major city, cities can't function without an excellent public transport system. But because many of them depend heavily on fares, as ridership goes down, funding goes down, and there have been really serious cuts. The only good news there is that the mayors have made enough of an issue in at least a couple of countries that the national governments are starting to step in. We haven't seen that in Canada yet. Here, it's a provincial responsibility, really. Hopefully, it starts to happen, but it's a big worry as we recover. If you want a low carbon recovery, it's about transportation, it's about how we manage waste, it's about how we deal with emissions from buildings, and it's about how we generate our electricity, which is what my book's about. Picking the best practices that are happening globally and saying, let's do all of these things everywhere now. But the transportation is really critical, and that's where I think some of your work around small business and the thinking of your group around transport. What do we do in this moment to help build cities where people can operate on a neighborhood basis, can use their local small businesses, can make sure there's good economic exchanges on a neighborhood basis in cities and towns that you can get around without having to drive a car or without using a polluting vehicle. I mean, it's a real moment to address that issue.
And so I think that's so true. And I think one of the points you're highlighting there, though, is the difference between cities, right? The difference between cities in terms of where their emissions come from. And one of the most compelling figures that I saw, I think, was from a BBC article, which showed what happened to emissions in the month of March. And so we're seeing now, what is the impact of this lockdown? Because it's this bizarre natural experiment in terms of doing something severe, extreme, punishing things that most people would not want to have to do again, and seeing what that does to emissions. And they show emissions in Paris, for instance, going down something like 72% in the month of March, but going down 10% in the city of New York. And that is very much to do with where the emissions are coming from. And, if they're all transportation related, as they are in Paris largely, and electricity is coming from nuclear, as it does for Paris, this kind of thing, then everybody's staying home and not driving around and whatever. It does absolutely ratchet down your emissions in this extreme way. Not so much for New York. So to me, that makes 2 points. One is certainly that absolutely taking this window of opportunity to really ratchet up progress on active and mass transport, but particularly active transport infrastructure that improves physical health and mental well-being, as well as reducing emissions, et cetera, that kind of thing. This is an important window of opportunity. That, though, does rely on, are the seeds already planted? Do you have the political climate in that city to advance that agenda? So we're seeing really, really different approaches to that window of opportunity. But then there's this other huge sort of elephant in the room. If we literally shut down the economy and tell everyone to stay home for months, and it only reduces emissions by 10%, it really calls into question this old story that it's about you and I making individual decisions, changing our own personal behaviors, and that alone will reduce emissions enough to reach the targets that you described. And I mean, in my view, it has never been the case that individual action is sufficient. And so it's the way our cities are designed, the way they're structured, and how, where our electricity comes from and how our buildings are heated and all of that, that is a collective decision made not just by government, but by, multiple groups collaboratively. But it isn't an individual story about, the sort of guilt message of you as a person need to change your behavior, otherwise we won't reach these targets. So it's a natural experiment like none I've ever seen, but it gives some glimpse into the depth of change that has to happen in our cities to reach those targets of having emissions by 2030 and net neutral by 2050. I mean, we need essentially the reduction we've seen this year. We're expecting like a 4 to 8% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 4 to 6 or something like that this year because of this incredible shutdown. We actually need that without all of this disruption and chaos and economic carnage every year between now and 2030 and now in 2050 to get where we're going. That's remarkable. That's a lot.
Well, I just want to pick up on your last 2 points. I mean, in a way, it's something good that's coming out of this very difficult moment and this really tragic moment for a lot of families. I mean, a lot of families have lost people they love, and I think that needs to be forefront of everybody's minds, and it's certainly forefront of the mayor's minds. But because things are shut down, emissions are less, and you're quite right, Sarah, and people don't talk about this very much, and I'm glad to hear you talk about it, how the results of this from a climate change perspective need to be replicated. So now we've really, from my perspective, kind of run out of time. So if you look, you can analyze greenhouse gases all sorts of different ways. You're a professor. I'm a almost recovered politician. We look at things differently. I very much believe in facts and working from science. I also believe in the power of narrative. So, I try to put things passionately and persuasively. But if you analyze greenhouse gas emissions from a city perspective, which is one of the ways to do them, cities can account for about 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, and including things like power plants that are outside the cities. So, and if you look at that from our cities, the major cities, most of those emissions are in transport buildings, how you generate electricity, and waste. And all of those areas have real actions today that can dramatically reduce emissions that are being done somewhere that should be done everywhere. Mm-hmm. And I'll give an example, and it connects to your point about individuals. New York City has a mandate now. They passed it last year. It was fairly controversial, but buildings have to meet certain carbon reduction requirements by 2030. And it's building on what you said. New York is different than a lot of cities. Its transportation emissions as a percentage of overall emissions within the city are relatively low. And that's partly because Manhattan is so dense, so people walk or take transit. They tend not to drive because you can't get anywhere. Oddly, is probably a good thing. So for New York to succeed on climate, they need to really address buildings. And of course, it's an important thing to say that new buildings need to be built to the highest possible standards, which are passive house or net zero. And in fact, certainly in North America, we could mandate that all new buildings by, let's say, 2025 are built to those standards. But that's not where the bulk of the emissions are. The bulk of the emissions are with buildings that already exist, because most of them are still going to be here in 2050. So New York, by mandating this, it's really powerful. It does a couple of things. It creates an industry of people who know how to do deep energy retrofits on buildings. It also creates some economic opportunities. For example, New York has a Green Jobs Corps in which they're training young people from low-income neighborhoods to be able to get the technically skilled jobs to do deep energy retrofits on buildings, some of which will be technological, some of which will be physical. But that's New York. That should be being done at that scale everywhere. Now, New York has different powers than some other places. Toronto sort of is pursuing this in a voluntary way, which gets you along the way. Benchmarking, which Mayor Bloomberg did when he was mayor of New York before Mayor de Blasio, got them to here. But to get here, You have to have some kind of regulatory authority. And if you do all of that, the changes are really massive and scalable, both within New York and if other cities do the same thing. And that idea is expanded to other cities in the US, by the way. Of course, I believe people should think about their own habits. We sold our car a few years ago. We take transit or walk or ride bikes everywhere. If we really need a car for a big grocery load or something, we take Zipcar or Communato. My daughter's vegan, my wife's vegetarian. I try to only eat meat on weekends, which is a huge improvement for me. We do a lot. I need to do more. This crisis has made me really think about, my own personal impact. But I'm with you. These systemic changes, like changing the electricity grid, changing our building stock, which, by the way, makes for better buildings. It doesn't just create jobs and deal with climate change. It makes better buildings for people to live and work in. Dealing with waste management properly, and giving people, planning cities and building them around active transportation and public transit, and electrifying public transit, electrifying private transportation. Those are things that are very hard for an individual to choose to do. We
Absolutely.
can choose to do those things collectively. And I'm actually very hopeful, because at some point in time, people are going to say, I want to live in places that have clean air and that aren't destroying the planet. And what do we need to do? And I think that moment's kind of now. So I'm glad you raised it, because we do kind of, narrative always defaults to, our choices, which are important, but the collective choices we make, I think, have much more of an impact.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think that the tricky bit about that storyline is that we always revert back to the individual storyline, because it has very clear, specific, just do these top 10 things, and then you can sleep well at night, and you feel like you've done your part. And then the collective side of that is a lot mushier. And so what do I do as an individual if this is actually a governance challenge more than an individual behavior change challenge? And I think voting is one of those things, certainly, if we think that the response is a collective one. But I want to pick up on just, and maybe we can talk a little bit, I hope this is the Dustin that I think it is, asking a question in the Q&A. And Deborah, I don't mean to be taking the Q&A out of your hands, but I think this window of opportunity we have in the COVID recovery years, because it's going to be a long recovery process, is so important. Because we're seeing these calls for, shovel-ready projects, right? Like, how do we get stimulus money out? How do we get people working? And in Canada's case, given, the collective trauma in the oil and gas sector, we need people to be reskilled and equitably, justly redirected into more sustainable sectors. And one that you mentioned there is the deep decarbonization retrofitting. And yes, we can do it voluntarily and one-off, but the scale of retrofits, the pace of retrofits that has to happen every year to meet the kind of targets that we're setting is, unprecedented, and needs to be coordinated. And there needs to be a massive push of labor towards the kind of skill set required to do those retrofits, and a regulatory approach as well, requiring those retrofits. So there's that. I mean, retrofitting alone could be an incredible job creator that also supports a more sustainable outcome. But, on the new building side, it just sort of breaks my heart every time a major investment is made in infrastructure that is continuing to contribute to this high carbon inertia. It's such a lost opportunity when a building that has a 100-year or 50-year lifespan, or infrastructure that has a 75-year lifespan, is supporting that, that sort of old high carbon pathway. So I really hope that in Canada and elsewhere, and I see some promising moves at the federal level, that recovery funds for COVID will be tagged in a real meaningful way towards, a sustainable transition. Which might mean, as you asked, Dustin, about that federal municipal partnership being better resourced rather than putting this all on the shoulders of cities.
Well, yes, I hope so too. I mean, on this particular issue, as you well know, and I don't know the backgrounds of the people on the call, so I don't know if people know this, but the federal government has a building code. It's not mandatory, but it's an important influence. It kind of sets a template. They've been consulting the entire time the Liberal government's been in power about what the new federal building code should look like that isn't mandatory. You know, in the same time frame, the city of Vancouver brought in a really bold building code. The builders went to the then government, the previous government, the Liberals, although in BC, the BC provincial Liberal Party is quite conservative through the sort of the social credits, and said, hey, wait a minute, Vancouver's going too far here. So that, and said, oh, well, and their argument they used was, well, you can't have different cities setting different standards. That doesn't work for the industry. So BC created something called a step code. They said, you have to do the same thing. And if you want to be advanced, you got to do it this way. So Vancouver then said, okay, well, here are our steps. And they have this unbelievably advanced building code that basically is going to force buildings to be passive house standards. I think by 2030, it's going to deal with embodied carbon in concrete. You're probably, in addition to using concrete that has carbon injected into it, which is so I understand it, the best form of a product that's very bad for the environment. In addition to that, you're probably going to have to be building buildings with 25% less concrete, for example. So they're dealing with embodied carbon, they're dealing with building operations, all sorts of stuff. So what Vancouver did was take advantage of the new BC legislation, and they've now got probably the most progressive building code in the world. Why can't the federal government just take theirs and say, this is the kind of thing you should do nationally? This stuff drives me crazy. Yeah. China's ahead of us. Right? China's doing really good stuff on new buildings, and we've been consulting about it for 5 or 6 years. Like, you know, a mayor doesn't have 5 or 6 years to consult, and that's the reason mayors tend to be active. They have to consult, and they have to listen, sometimes legally through the Planning Act, often just because that's embedded in the fabric of city government, but then you got to act. And I find at the national level, it's often too easy to duck action. And at this moment, post-COVID, there isn't any choice on climate and on other things. We really need very real, meaningful actions that prevent another crisis. And I believe people will be open to that. They'll understand, look at what happened. We didn't properly prepare for this crisis. Do you want another one coming? And look what's going on in Michigan. There's dams breaking because of a 500-year storm. Second one in that area in 4 years. That's a 1,000-year storm. So I think people are ready, but they want to see action, not talk. And I hope that governments like the one in Ottawa who say the right things understand the imperative to move.
Yeah. So I wonder, would it be okay, David and Sarah, if I break in here, because we have the question from Dustin, but also one from Scott Morton, and both have been unmuted. Both are clearly concerned about the same thing. So David said, you know, municipalities are currently running significant deficits, okay? Without cash bailouts from the federal government, what capacity will they actually have to contribute to a sustainable recovery and undertake, David, the kind of systemic things that you were just talking about? And then Scott Morton noted, you know, that cities collect 8 cents of every tax dollar collected, which is, you know, not enough. So they're even more financially constrained. So, you know, what is the answer to that? To what degree can municipalities actually contribute to that sort of green recovery that everybody seems to, well, that a lot of people seem to desire so much?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to understand municipal finance because it's highly relevant to this moment. So if you have a city like Toronto, it has a serious financial issue for 2 reasons. One, because a significant proportion of its budget came from user fees, particularly the Toronto Transit Commission. So without that revenue, it has got a serious problem, not just in providing transit service, because it has to provide transit service, You can't really adjust it down to the level of revenues they're getting. Second problem that's particular to Toronto is it has a reliance on the land transfer tax, and presumably those revenues will go down. Having brought in the land transfer tax, which sort of preserved Toronto's ability to provide a very good level of services over the last decade, I'm well aware that city finance staff have been warning all along, you have to be putting some of this in the bank because the real estate market goes up and down. You know, please put it in the bank. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to be political, but it's factual. You know, my successor chose to freeze taxes and empty the reserves and so forth. So and use not put some of the land transfer tax in the bank. So it wasn't saved for a rainy day, which is unfortunate. That's Toronto. Cities that don't have as much of a reliance on user fees like transit revenues and don't have a land transfer tax won't see their revenues impacted nearly as badly as federal and provincial governments, because the property tax doesn't work that way. So that's the first part of understanding. Now, Toronto's got a really tough road to hoe. From my perspective, the provincial government's in court right now arguing that it can abolish Toronto's elections on a whim without any public consultation. So the flip side of that is pay up. You know, at this moment, Toronto needs probably, I'd say, $1.5 billion in lost transit revenues for this year and next. The province should be paying up, just writing the check and not hesitating. It's really shocking that they aren't, but they've got some political cover. I hope the pressure builds. Second structural point to remember that's really, really significant on what we do about climate is that in a city government, the operating budgets and the capital are very separate. In provincial and feds, it's all sort of mingled, and you know they run huge deficits. Well, city, it's quite different. And right now, money, we're almost at a state of negative interest rates. Money, if for a borrower the size of the city of Toronto, money is almost free. So oddly, it's a really bad moment for operating the city, but a very good moment to invest in things for the future. So if a smart finance department of the city, a smart environment department, and smart elected officials will think about how do they use capital money smartly today to build a city that's far more resilient to future crises, including climate, and what are the mechanisms that allow you to do that? For example, there's a program called HiRise in Toronto, HI-RIS. It's about energy retrofits in residential high-rise buildings. It has a financing mechanism where essentially the building owners borrow from the city and repay it through the property taxes. There's no reason right now that the city can't make that program massive, because the cost of money is so little and it gets repaid through the energy savings over time through property taxes. So from a city financial budget perspective, it's completely feasible. They also you need to think about what are the interventions that you can use this relatively cheap money, this very cheap money, not relatively. What are the interventions that are pretty cheap to do that make a meaningful difference? Repurposing road for bikes and pedestrians is basically free. You paint a line, basically free. What about in the inner suburbs in Toronto? There's big distances. So, you know, while you need facilities there's a lot of people who bike there for people to be able to get around within those suburbs. People are going between. If there isn't excellent public transit, we tend to drive. What about building busways? In the big scheme of things, that's very inexpensive. The city of Toronto, and I'm being very particular to Toronto here, I'm not answering the more general question, but it has 2 projects on its books that between them will cost about $7 billion of public funds. The first is the one-stop subway extension in Scarborough. It's listed, I think, as 4. Trust me, it'll be 6. The second is keeping up the Gardiner, which is $1 billion. It's $500 million to take it down, and you get a better city, and you create space for people, and you create walkable, livable neighborhoods, and a grand boulevard, and you have a completely different experience. This is east from, I think, Yonge to the Don Valley. So you can save $500 million there. You could save probably $3 billion if you didn't build, and I don't think it's going to get built anyway, the one-stop subway extension. Instead, completed that area by light rail, built the light rail extension from the Eglinton LRT into the University of Scarborough and Centennial College, and then used the rest of the money to build busways. These are only a couple of examples, but if you think about this and just go back to what is it we need to do that creates a low carbon city and creates one that's equitable and fair? Well, transit's really important because people who are working 2 or 3 part-time jobs and not being paid more than minimum wage all take transit. So you need really good transit. It's got to be safe. You need more service right now, not less, so people can distance. But at the same time, it needs to have reliable, accessible service. And that's why you build things like busways and light rail. And by the way, you could do that and have pretty quickly over the next year or two, have a network all over Toronto. You'd have the resulting economic benefits and income and sales tax revenues, and you'd save money from building the one-stop subway extension, and you'd save money if you stopped doing the Gardner. And it's that, whether I'm right in that or not, and sorry, just let me make a final point, it's that kind of thinking that if cities do, there's a real potential now, even though they're under massive operating budget pressure, there's real potential to make the change that's needed.
I just wondered if Dustin wanted to respond or have a follow-up question.
I think that gets to much of the base of it, and it is the Dustin you're thinking of, Sarah. That gets to the core of it. Knew that there was a lot of operating pressure. Saw news from Edmonton today that they might have to shut down their transit system over the summer if this carries on. But it seems like, in your estimation, based in large part due to the low borrowing costs at the moment, that there is still that capacity for municipalities that might be in a financial hole for quite a while without a federal bailout to still plan forward for some of this sustainable transformation that we need to really start planning for today.
But David, I also wonder though, I also wonder in those cities where user fees aren't a major source of income, is there not the risk with foreclosures and the hit to the property on the property side that the flow of cash from property taxes wouldn't be as deep and rich as normal?
Yes, and I'm not trying to minimize the current challenges. If you have a major transit system, you are heavily reliant on user fees, and unless the provinces step up to their responsibility, because it's their responsibility, it's not Ottawa's. It'd be nice if Ottawa stepped in, but it's a provincial responsibility. They need to sign the checks now, or they're going to see their major cities have to shut down very significant parts of their transit system or have very poor service. No question about that. In terms of the foreclosures and things, ultimately somebody has to pay the property taxes, Sarah. So, there is a risk if things went very, very, very sideways. Absolutely, but they are first in line before mortgages. So ultimately, the cities get their money. They're sort of who always got their man? Was it the Mounties?
Yes.
So cash flow, yes, no question, they're going to be cash flow constrained, but ultimately, they will collect most, if not all, of that money. Ultimately, unlike when sales taxes go down, if there's no sales taxes because nobody's buying clothes, that's gone.
I think Scott Morton had his hand up. Scott, did you have a question? And you are muted at the there you go.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I do have one question. Well, I have a lot of very interesting discussion. I agree with what's been said, and I absolutely agree that cities are crucial actors when it comes to transformations and climate action. And so I had the question about the financial revenue as well. and the fact that it's so low. I'm interested to hear your point about capital expenditures, this being an excellent time to do capital expenditures. You've mentioned a few great things that I think cities could do. Another one that I wonder about is housing. Most cities in Canada have a lack of affordable housing. I worked in the city of St. John's and was their affordable housing coordinator when they had one of their worst housing crises in their history. So my question, I wonder about, is this a time when cities could be looking at building low-cost housing in transport corridors, and that's highly energy efficient? So you're lowering the building emissions, you're lowering transport emissions because you're bringing people into the core. You know, partnering with the private sector so that it's not all government doing the spending, but government could access some of the funding for those projects. Wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I'm going to defer to Sarah first because I've talked a heck of a lot, and also I think she's in a rhythm because of her work on business that would have a perspective on this.
Thanks. No, I actually think your perspective on this would be really helpful, and Scott has all the time in the world to ask me questions because I'm his PhD supervisor.
Well, I didn't know. How was I to know that?
But I do, one point that Scott brought up that I do want to highlight, which comes back to one of your original points, David, is the equity concerns in rebuilding. And I think it's really important that the story about COVID is starting to finally, highlight the fact that this is not the great equalizer or whatever. This is not hitting all populations in the same way. And in a lot of cases, it's just sort of pulling back the veil, to reveal all of those pre-existing inequalities, right? The deep fractures, the vulnerable populations, the people who didn't have access to healthcare in the United States, the people who have precarious employment here and everywhere, those vulnerabilities and those marginalized populations are suffering more and will suffer more as this unfolds. So holding up equity next to sustainability as guideposts for recovery investment, I think is crucial and was necessary anyway in the conversation around deep decarbonization and the transition towards sustainability. I think we tend, depending on the bubble we live in, whether it's an urban bubble or a Central Eastern bubble, I think we tend to be flippant about the oil and gas sector and the livelihoods and the communities that supports, and not consider deeply enough how to transition folks away from the jobs that they had that gave them a livelihood, but also pride and a family tradition and all of this, and really think carefully about how to offer dignity and economic resilience in a low carbon world. So I really like Scott's suggestion that highly efficient, built to the highest sustainability standards, but also affordable housing along transit corridors be part of the recovery.
So a whole bunch of thoughts from Scott's question and your answer, Sarah. First of all, I agree about the dignity and the fact that we have to include the workers who work in oil and gas in the conversation. We're, with knock on wood, because we're supposed to get confirmation today or tomorrow, some funding for it, but we're about to start a project with several of our cities globally on just transition. And how do we help ensure that meaningful work, good jobs, well-paid jobs, goes right to the same people? Not saying there's lots of jobs in solar, so you don't have to worry about losing your job in a gas-fired power plant. How do we help those specific people? And it's a real political and a factual challenge, but it's a question that has to be answered. In terms of the equity stuff, as a citizen, I guess, I am appalled by how the personal care workers in seniors' homes and how the workers in meatpacking plants, for example, and others have borne the brunt of COVID. It's really shocking and very revealing about our society. And I think it's one of the reasons why both the response has to be equitable from a factual perspective, and I think from a political perspective. I believe people have really noticed this. It's the big takeaway from COVID. And my analysis is one of political power. You know, both those groups of workers tend to often be newcomer Canadians because it's a job they can get. They work incredibly hard. They have no political power. So the problem in the nursing homes is you have to work multiple part-time jobs. The problem in the meat plants is you're working a terrible job shoulder to shoulder, or a job in terrible conditions, I should say, shoulder to shoulder. And both of those groups are predominantly people who don't have a vote. And I think Canadians recognize this. And what does it mean for cities? Well, a couple of things, and you know, I'll get to the point of the question. First of all, in their recoveries, they have purchasing powers, they have operating powers, they have collective agreements with unions. Can they turn and lead a movement to turn these part-time jobs into full-time ones? They have an obligation to inspect nursing homes for public health. Should the public health inspectors be instructed to say, we've learned from this pandemic, it's not healthy if people work part-time. You can't have part-time workers being given such little pay and so few hours. They've got to work in 3 or 4 places. It's too much of a health risk. You have to have full-time people at decent wages. I think city public health inspectors would be within their rights to do that, but it takes political leadership. And on the housing, I very much agree. It's a moment where people are going to be looking to leadership that addresses these inequalities. Things may be difficult for cities, may be difficult for cities to mobilize the funding from other governments for affordable housing, from province and federal. So they need to be creative. So can they fund it in a way that there's a revenue stream to pay back their money, using the fact they can borrow at very low interest rates now? Can they use their zoning powers creatively? You know, in Toronto, I rode my bike a couple of weeks ago, early on a Sunday morning. It was fantastic. There was nobody on the road. It was really quite surreal, but from a cyclist perspective, it was fantastic. From Hyde Park to Victoria Park. So it was about 20 some odd kilometers. And you go on there and most of the buildings in that stretch are 2-story. Why don't in Toronto we say, along here, you can build an 8 to 10-story building as of right, as long as it meets environmental standards, certain design standards that matter, and gives a certain portion to the city for permanent affordable housing, which will be rental. Maybe it's 4 units, whatever, you could work it out. And developers would actually be interested because one of the problems they have building those mid-rise buildings is the time it takes to go through a development application is about the same as a big building. So there are ways the city, I don't know if that idea is good or not, I happen to like it because it's mine, but there are ways the city can be creative at this moment. And I think well thought out policies will be very well received by people right now if they know it's going to result in affordable housing, in housing for the homelessness, and their children are going to be able to afford to live in what's an expensive city. And I think that those principles apply in lots of different cities globally. I'm just using Toronto as an example because of that particular feature it has.
David, I wonder if I could move to 2 new questions, and they also have implications for what Sarah was saying a little bit earlier about political will. So Kate Daly writes, it was already challenging for municipal governments to, make the transition to green or low energy, low carbon economy, right, and infrastructure. And that COVID has the potential to exacerbate this perception that municipalities are out of touch with the needs of community members and private sector jobs, and Sarah, maybe even SMEs, what they need sort of on the community level. How should municipalities generate and sustain the political will to make big changes in the next couple of years?
So I would have a couple of comments, and that's a great question. I always come back to political will as the crucial ingredient. But I mean, David could speak to this better than anyone, that political will being sustained and fed by public will, right? It's not something that an individual just steps out and has. It's a collective uprising and effort. And there's two comments that I just want to make on that. One is that, not to derail this conversation by talking about a carbon tax, because that's a rabbit hole that we could go down another time. But I had a conversation with a very well-intentioned and brilliant economist who said, now's the time to increase the carbon tax. You know, the price of a barrel of oil is so low, gas, you know, the price of a liter of gas at the pump is so low. People won't even notice it. Like it won't hit that hard. David, tell me, from a politician's perspective, would this be the right time to send the signal that we're going to tax people more? You know, to me, it just seemed, and I'm a huge supporter of pricing carbon appropriately, and that being one of many, many tools, not the silver bullet, but one of many tools in accelerating the transition. But to me, it seems like a really challenging sell politically to say that now is the time that a carbon tax needs to increase, at least any more than it was planned to go up before. And yet I understand how the impact on behavior might be dampened by the fact that, you know, the price of a liter of gas or whatever is so much lower now. So that's really a challenging one that I think we will struggle to build political will in support of now, given the economic hardship that people are facing and the joblessness and that kind of thing. But the last part of your question, Kate, about how should municipalities generate and sustain the political will to make big changes, to me, this has always been a question of demonstrating two things. One, the kind of communities that we want to live in. You know, what do we want our communities to look like? Not just environmentally, because I don't think anybody really can, you know, viscerally feel what lower emissions, you know, industries or cities is like. What we know is our physical health. We know how far we have to be in our car, you know, how long we have to be in our car to get to the places we want to go. We know what kind of foods we eat, you know, where we take our kids to do activities or how we get them to school. We know our sort of lived experience in cities. And too often the climate change conversation is kind of this abstract, like GHG related conversation, or just talking about the natural environment, when to me, it's like absolutely deeply interwoven with the physical health of our cities, the mental health of our cities, the resilience of our economy, all of that together. So a vision of what our communities should actually be like to experience, and that is that narrative that you mentioned earlier, David, that storytelling that's so important. And then demonstrating the co-benefits, you know, that we're doing this one thing, you know, we're moving towards active transportation. It's going to ratchet our emissions down by X%, but we're also going to see this improvement in respiratory related illness, in obesity, in so many different, you know, of our, more of our priorities than just the environmental one. And that co-benefits case, I think, is what will help to, you know, to fuel political will, I think.
David, did you want to take a crack at that too?
I think that's all true. I think and I agree with it completely. You know, in answer to Kate's question, I guess two things. First is that the polls consistently show that climate change is top of mind or near top of mind for people. Obviously more so before COVID, but it'll come back. And, you know, when you see things like the wildfires in Australia and the fires outside LA, and, you know, people are retweeting photos of people giving koala bears at the side of the road by a fire water from their water bottle. I mean, it's really obvious that there's something bloody wrong. So I think the way you address this is critically important. And, you know, if you come in to run for office and say, I'm going to make you all worse off at a time you've got great economic insecurity, but I'm going to do something abstract, like deal with climate change, you're not going to be very likely for success. And this is one of the reasons I've been kind of ambiguous about a carbon tax for a couple of reasons. One is I think it makes the message that to fight climate change, you've got to make your life worse. And it's the exact opposite. We're talking about building better places to live, as Sarah just pointed out, are cleaner and healthier and more interesting and have way more jobs. So by making the first interaction most people have with it punitive. I don't know if it's wise, and it also creates something else. Even if when it's accepted, as it was, 70% of Canadians supported a carbon tax in the last election. There's this kind of, oh, we've got the carbon tax, so it's solved. Well, it isn't at all. You know, okay, it's the price of admission because you want it there for industrial operations. But I think it obscures the fact, you know, I've talked to people about parks. I've talked to people about making the city easier for them and their families to safely, cleanly get around. I've talked to people about, you know, do you want some really good coffee shops? Well, if you do, we need some more density downtown because we need enough people here to support them. You know, things like that matter to people's lives. And I've talked to them about the jobs that kind of jobs that young people want. You know, I've had the privilege of speaking on numerous conferences, and I meet all sorts of people from businesses there are coming and speaking about environmental issues. And to a person, when I've said to them, why is your company trying to set high environmental standards? They've said, we can't hire young people unless we do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, you know, which I think actually goes to the point Sarah made before, and I fiddled here a minute ago to see if I could find my book. It's covered with comments from my copy editor. But at the end of it, one of the things that I say is, people ask me, what can I do? And the three things I say are similar to what I said when I gave the commencement speech at Waterloo, but I really believe in them. Use your voice, use your actions, and use your vote. And it is amazing how powerful people's voices are. So one of the things to say to people in a smaller community where people are economically struggling is about their children. You know, what kind of jobs do you want your kids to have? Do you want them to have a job that's going to last in an industry that's going to be here in another 30 years? And why ask them, what do they think about environmental issues? There's a way to do it, but I agree. I'm Kate, you know, look, I didn't run again in 2010, and look what happened. But we had someone of a rather different disposition and set of values, although when Councillor Ford was on my council, he did vote for the city's climate plan in 2007. So there you go. But you know, it's an art, not a science, politics. But I think there are ways to talk to people about this that can get them on side, and particularly if you're doing things like taking old buildings and renewing them, and they can see it, and their neighbor's son or neighbor's daughter is working. You know, the neighbor's daughter has got a chance to be a carpenter, and she's working on that building. And you've got a whole program of that kind of stuff, and they can see it, feel it, and touch it. I think there's a way to do it that can really work.
So Kate, I wonder if you wanted to respond to that at all?
Yeah, just a quick thought. I have a background in using narrative methods in political science for my PhD, but I'm now a municipal climate change professional. So I'm interested in all the different angles of this. And I think something that I'm interested in as well, and I'm glad to hear the sort of things that you're thinking about, or I hope things that municipal staff and councillors are starting to think about. But also, I'm interested in the difference between municipal staff and councillors and how we empower those two very different groups. I ran into Rick Lochtenberg a while ago when we were allowed to run into people, and he was telling me that he thought they were seeing a shift in the climate caucus between a time when staff were really pushing the climate agenda and councillors were more hesitant, but that they're seeing that go the other way a bit now in terms of councillors being more pushing the boundaries and staff providing hesitance on public opinion grounds, which I thought was interesting. So anyway, I'm interested in that pattern and what that might mean for some of the planning to actually get municipalities across Ontario and across the world moving on some of these.
Kate, do you mean by public opinion grounds, do you mean that the councillors are taking the temperature of the public and saying they're demanding of us more significant action, and the civil servants, the practitioners, are saying you want to run too fast and practically it's too tough?
I think that was Rick's perception, and I think it's an interesting question. And I'm not sure how much it might vary across municipalities, but certainly the question of whether staff are also hesitant to propose or even support big changes on the grounds that they feel that there'll be a backlash.
Yeah, well, you've analyzed that brilliantly. I don't know if you're writing things up, send them to me. I want to read them and learn. I think you've put your finger on something really fascinating. And to me, that ultimately reflects public opinion. I mean, everybody's consumed by COVID. The mayors of the C40 are trying to ensure as we come out of it, it's a low carbon recovery. And they're, one of our roles is to help them think about how to talk about it. And we haven't quite got there yet. That's happening over the next month. But how do you talk about low carbon in a world where people are, their first thing is, am I going to have a job? But that issue and the issue of whether political leadership or public service leadership is driving the agenda are both really critical ones. And if you're working on those, I think that work is highly, highly relevant. And I would encourage people to, if you're not, to research those kinds of issues.
I would.
Really helpful.
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
Yeah, I would just echo that. And honestly, I don't know. I mean, David, you seemed optimistic that climate change would rise back on the list of priorities. That concerns me, actually. I mean, it has always concerned me that there is, on the surface, Canadians will say that it's an important topic, but then when it comes down to the nuts and bolts and the costs of the policies required to get us to those targets, the support sort of falters. And that's in the best of days. That's when the economy is roaring and things are going well, and then what seems maybe to some like a nice to have, at least that was the argument years ago, that the environment comes after you deal with other needs, which of course is completely backwards. But it has always worried me that a calamitous global event, a war, a pandemic, knocks around that list of priorities, and getting climate change back up where it should be, or embedding it, as we've been talking about this whole time, in recovery efforts, really becomes a challenge.
And I wonder if I can pivot right there from what you just said, Sarah, to Jeff's question. Jeff is up on the screen as well, and essentially he was saying governments are going to be so hugely indebted that there's not going to be a lot of subsidization, and in fact there might have to be mandates. But what appetite is there to actually pursue mandates, particularly at federal and provincial levels of government? It kind of relates back to what we were talking about with Kate as well.
Well, I think all these questions come together in a way. And ultimately, this depends on what people want. And it depends on the success in political and to some extent other leaders being able to talk about climate change in a persuasive way that's effective in persuading people to do allow their governments to do the right thing. And I think the point about mandates is probably true. Maybe there's much more of a role for mandates in a fiscally constrained environment. Although I do believe, as in the example of Toronto, it's still a matter of priorities, and that if you're helping people see a future that is better for them and their families, you can find some ways to invest in it as well. I was in office through the Great Recession and the aftermath, and so it's different than COVID. COVID's going to be longer, but I saw firsthand what happened to the narrative around climate change over the course of the American housing bubble bursting, the world economy tanking, on the path to the Conference of the Parties 15 in Copenhagen, Denmark, which was a year later. And in the course of that year, we went from everything being about forestalling an economic disaster to a very robust conversation about climate the next year. And I think, if Canada had had a different government at the time, I think the world would have reached agreement in Copenhagen. I may be overly optimistic, but we were one of the governments that tried to stop it by objecting to, semicolons and commas and things like that. Maybe that's oversimplifying, but it was a very closely run thing. It's very sad that it failed, but my point is, a year after the global financial crisis, there was a healthy and active debate around climate and a significant majority in favor of action. In fact, if I can just tell a quick story, sorry, Deborah, I don't want to take all the time, but I received, on behalf of Canada, because the Canadian government wouldn't accept it, an award, a mock award from environmentalists in Copenhagen called the Fossil of the Day.
Yeah.
So they were awarding, the previous federal government the Fossil of the Day for doing the most to block negotiations. And I took it and I gave a speech. And in my speech, I said I was embarrassed to be Canadian. The Globe and Mail wrote the most scorching editorial the next day about how I'm in another country and I shouldn't say bad things about our government. And, I've lost.
You're a Dixie
right
chick. This is the Dixie Chicks experience.
Exactly. Yeah. Except I can't sing, but they have more viewers. So it was just, I was excoriated. Apparently, you lose your freedom of speech when you're a mayor, according to the Globe and Mail. My Dom Wanagus, who was my director of communications, wrote them and said, "This isn't fair. The mayor deserves a response." And he negotiated a live kind of webcast before there was video with Globe and Mail readers for an hour, in which I answered questions about my position from Copenhagen. Globe and Mail readers, okay? Not the Naomi Klein set, a predominantly conservative group of Canadians, red Tories and right. That would define Globe and Mail readership. So we did this online thing. It was fantastic. And in the middle of it, the Globe, without our permission, ran a question and said, "Are you, like David Miller, embarrassed by the Harper government's actions in Copenhagen?" We didn't know that question was going to be asked. 70% of people said yes.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Right? So there is a real, people understand this issue. They want to see leadership, but it's got to be actions. They won't believe words at this point. And I think you answer all of these things with actions. And if it has to be mandates in certain places, certain things, building codes and so forth, absolutely, make it mandates. But people know there's a real problem. They know we've just been blindsided by this pandemic. They'll want to see action. And I think there's a real place to move action, whether it's through mandates or creative financing or otherwise.
Jeff, did you want to jump in there and respond?
Yes, I'd just like to add something. The model in the United States of environmental regulation has often been for the federal government to set standards and allow industry, and it could be cities, to compete on how to best meet them. And I think that has a lot of promise in the future. It could be applied to cities as well, but it allows for more of a free market approach. The government creates the mandate, and then others, could be cities, could be private business, they're allowed to take the most effective approach, and it could be perhaps some level of subsidies they would compete with. But I think the role of mandates is going to be quite important in the future. I don't disagree with what David said. But, well, let me just add one point. There's a study that came out just this week by Yale that shows that in the United States that support for climate change action is really baked in. It hasn't gone down as a result of the pandemic. It's there. People, as David was saying earlier, people want both. They want clean air, they want action on climate change, and they want action on the pandemic. And they're not saying, which is very traditional, that because the economy's super bad, we can't do anything about the environment. That's not happening in public opinion in the United States, which I think is very interesting.
And I think you might be right that I hope that the same is true here in Canada. And I think it's a reminder to sort of think, you know, at each time when this dynamic has emerged, there's been progress and then a shock of some variety, nothing like quite like this, but other shocks in the past. I mean, the context is different. I mean, it seems like an eternity ago, but this was, the last year was the year of, you know, Fridays for Future and some, you know, some of the biggest climate mobilizations, well, the biggest climate mobilizations ever. So you're right that the baseline public awareness and demand for not just talk, but real results, I think is at a level that could withstand something like this, or be a part of the conversation of recovery.
So I wonder if I could use the prerogative of Q&A chair for just a second and ask Sarah a question. So at the very beginning, it was really interesting. David started off by saying, if there's, you know, one thing that cities could be doing, let's use New York as an example with retrofits. Inefficient building stock is a huge problem. On SMEs, what is that one thing that, you know, could be happening? And you know, my reference point is always the Netherlands, because they always seem to be doing something way more interesting, whether it's on water or climate or whatever. So, you know, I'm really interested to know, so on the SME side, because they're so much more vulnerable, they don't have the economic, you know, power to throw around that big corporations do, and they're situated in communities that are also resource poor.
Yeah.
So what is that one thing that we could be doing for SMEs?
Well, it depends on if the question is what's the one thing we could do for SMEs, or what's the one thing SMEs should do. Those are two different questions.
Let's see, the one thing we could, an initiative to take with SMEs that help us along in the green recovery, but also get, you know, shovels in the ground.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the most interesting things that I think our group is starting to come around to is, you know, there's lots of examples of SMEs that are doing really great things on their energy consumption, or, you know, their greenhouse gas emissions, or their water, or their waste, or whatever. Those are, and I don't mean to be flippant about those are huge and important. But where we really see innovative stuff happening is in kind of clusters and sort of ecosystems, not just one SME as a little island. You know, SMEs, small firms collaborate with rather than compete with other small firms. They work with civil society organizations. That might be chambers of commerce and boards of trade. It might be organizations like, you know, Waterloo's Sustainable Waterloo region. You know, those partnerships help build these sort of ecosystems of sustainable business where resources are shared, insights are shared, they can learn from each other's mistakes, they can sort of see themselves as a collective. And I think it's incumbent on municipal governments, provincial governments, federal governments to support that ecosystem, so that we have more resilient local economies, so that, you know, we don't see this sort of massive wave of SME closure, which I think we should expect. I think there's going to be tidal wave upon tidal wave of SMEs that have to close their doors probably forever, because, you know, their profit margins are so fine. And so those relationships really build resilience, I think, in communities, and also provide so many, again, like back to the co-benefit story, provide so much in terms of local food production and social cohesion. And, you know, SMEs are owned and operated by more different kinds of people than large companies. You know, they're more likely to be women-led, they're more likely to be led by newcomers to Canada, this kind of thing. So it's such an important way to foster an equitable and just sustainable recovery, I think.
Thank you. David, any ideas there? Or?
I will defer to the world's leading expert on that comment.
We should find that person.
So, well, I'd like to convey one last question from Annie, who's a student in the Balsley School, and she asked about networking between cities of the Global North and cities of the Global South, and wants to know whether that is actually going to be impacted by the pandemic or not. And both of you are uniquely well positioned to comment on, you know, whether networking still continues to occur, and you know, or whether it has been negatively impacted in terms of, you know, the kinds of things that Sarah was just talking about. So sharing lessons and making connections, and, you know, what is it that we could be doing in terms of recovery, et cetera. And Annie's with us now too.
Hi, Annie. That's a great question, and the answers roll off my tongue pretty easily about climate change in cities because I've been living this for 20 years, and I just see it so clearly. The path is there, and as someone pointed out, Jeff, it's going to be more mandates than financing in future, sure, but the path's there. This one, it's not nearly as clear to me, and I really worry. Through our organization, the mayors have been really collaborating east to west and north to south. We have a number of Chinese cities in our organization, and they're very active and doing some really interesting work. Shenzhen, for example, it's got an all-electric bus fleet, all-electric taxi fleet, and they've got 16,000 buses. The scale is massive. We've got a China buildings program that's working on the highest standards for new buildings, which really matters there in a bunch of reasons. So these collaborations are really excellent. There's even more happening because of COVID, but I'm very worried for global South cities post-COVID. They've got real resilience challenges for ecological, climate, and weather reasons. Jakarta is sinking. Jakarta is a region of 30 million people, and the government said they're going to move it. But how do you even conceive of that? And by the way, who's at the heart of the sinking city? It's the poorest people, of course. I made a comment earlier about the African city where half the people don't have access to drinking water. There's some really interesting best practices, like what Accra has done around regularizing waste management, so you don't have informal garbage dumps. The waste is taken to landfills and it's composted, and you regularize the jobs of the informal waste pickers and so forth. All sorts of interesting things which creates jobs, or at least regularizes jobs, lowers carbon, does a lot of stuff. But I very much worry about their capacity in a post-COVID world if they end up dealing with huge waves of pandemics. It's a very significant issue, and unless international financial institutions like the development banks and the World Bank start financing cities directly, at the moment they say they do, but they don't really, because they require a national government guarantee, and the national governments are often political rivals with the mayor in the main city, and they just don't issue those guarantees. They don't effectively finance cities. Unless they start figuring out how to do it, I'm really worried, particularly for the low-income people living in global South cities. And I see a path to helping them environmentally because we're already doing it. And their mayors are very active. The governor of Jakarta, through two or three different governors, has been highly active on the C40, for example. But post the economic consequences of the pandemic and post the health consequences of the pandemic, I don't see as clearly the economic strength of those cities. I think we should all be worried.
So I would just add one final thought on that, which is to echo my concern, to echo David's concern rather, about the impacts in the global South. And this was really brought home for me a couple of weeks ago. I sit on the scientific steering committee of this international research collaborative called the Earth System Governance Project. And there's about 13 people, and 8 or 9 are from North America and Western Europe. And we have one colleague from Brazil. And we were talking about an upcoming conference that we were to have in person, but now we'll have virtually. And we were talking about themes and how to, bring in COVID, and talking about maybe this is an opportunity, to build back better, and like all the things we've been talking about today. And my Brazilian colleague said, hold up, we are in the midst in Brazil of a political crisis. COVID is just going off the charts there. So they have an economic crisis, a political crisis, and a health crisis, and an environmental crisis all at the same time. There are extremely vulnerable communities packed very tightly together with limited, sanitation, infrastructure, and this kind of thing. So in the global South, the wave is just crashing onto shore there, and the resources are quite few in some cases to respond. So that was a helpful reality check for me in terms of my framing around COVID and recovery. But I would also just flip it to do justice in part to Scott Morton Mia, who asked a question earlier, and his work and thinking in his dissertation, there's also real opportunities to learn from the Global South, not just to help and teach the Global South in that way. And I think we see a lot of that in our work, and when we're focused on SMEs, there are really, really vibrant and creative informal economies, small business economies, really creative collaboratives and cooperatives in the Global South that have a lot to teach the North and or the West, or however you want to frame it, about how to have a resilient community. So that's not to dismiss the pressing global health crisis and the economic crisis to come, but I think that bi-directional flow is just so crucial.
So spot on, Sarah. I wish I'd said that. It's just so spot on. We become arrogant in the West and think we know everything. We really don't. You can learn enormous amounts from that. Our mayors are always saying they come to meetings thinking, I'm the mayor of Los Angeles and I think I'm going to tell people on it. They always comment they learn more from their colleagues in the developing world than the developed. Always, particularly around innovation. You're spot on.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for their questions, and I'm going to hand it over to Neil. Just a little reminder, though, if anyone is interested in joining our Environment and Resources Research Cluster at the Balsley School, just send an email to info@balsleyschool.ca, and we will welcome you with open arms. So, Neil, I'll leave you with a few closing comments.
Sure, thanks. Thanks so much, Deborah. I'm not going to try to sort of sum things up neatly. I mean, just some obvious quick takeaways is how much it's all connected. Whether it's equity, social justice, housing, employment, public health, and of course connections can be helpful and connections can be obstacles. And I think Sarah pointed to, and I've noticed this too, that there's two narratives going on right now. There's a kind of very optimistic narrative that some of these obstacles will come down because we're at a kind of political moment where we can perhaps envision a different world and there's opportunities to sort of show how these pieces can come together. And of course, there's a much more pessimistic narrative that's really these path-dependent connections are going to be too hard to overcome and will be pushed back into the same kinds of patterns that we've been in before. But it's also, I think, all connected politically, and in again, a number of ways. The importance of municipal authority, the importance of municipal finance, but how it connects up and down. And so we see a lot of constraints from provincial and federal governments in terms of how they deal with cities. And David talked, I think, interestingly around the role of things like international finance, but also the role of networks like David's, like C40, learning from one another. And I suppose, because I think inherently I'm a believer in the positive narrative, that I think the biggest takeaway for me was really around the democratic connections, that ultimately it is a moment where for political leadership, for people to put forward a compelling vision. And one of the things I was really thinking about, and I've been thinking about for a long time, is why do local municipalities seem to be so much the source of so much energy and innovation where other levels of government aren't? So what is it about municipalities that seems to be able to generate a different kind of politics around climate? And I don't have an answer, but I think it has something to do with accountability of municipal politicians. And I think it has something to do with the inherent moderation of municipal governments, that because they're not party structures, because they're not majorities, that they have to understand each other, they have to compromise with one another, and that creates a sort of more durable kind of politics instead of the swinging back and forth that we see on climate policy at the federal level. We've seen climate policy even across different administrations in the city of Toronto with vastly different ideological views, be resilient and come forward because other councillors and other views are there. So I think that ideally gives us some moments of, to leave on some positive thoughts. And I think we had two really fantastic guides to lead us through this discussion today. I can't count the number of times I've called on David to do favors for us and share some of his thoughts, and he's such a great friend of the University of Waterloo and our community. So thank you, David. And Sarah, you're such a generous colleague. You're always willing to do all sorts of things for us. So thank you as well, and thank you everyone else for joining us. And we'll see you in 2 weeks with Olaf and Christoph.